So in this video, we're just going to continue on with the example we started with in the last video. So in the last video, we looked at this breakdown of all the non-manufacturing and manufacturing overhead costs that Baxter Battery has incurred. And they broke it down into the production costs, which is manufacturing overhead, and these two non-manufacturing overhead categories of general admin and marketing. Shipping costs was the only costs that not in that table, along with direct materials and direct labor, because those are traceable costs, so we can just trace them immediately to a product. But all this extra work here is necessary for all those non-traceable costs, so we can assign them. So recall that Baxter Battery, they identified these different activity cost pools and their activity measures. So they broke it down into these 5 general cost buckets, or consumption or sources, or those things causing the consumption of resources at the end of the day. So they broke it down into these different sources of consumption. So what is really what is really consuming all of these overhead costs in the company? And they broke it down into these different cost pools here and the related measures for each cost pool. So now that we know that what all the overhead is that Baxter Battery incurs, both manufacturing and non-manufacturing, we want to take this overall $22 million, because that's all of it added together. We want to take all that $22 million and figure out how much of that $22 million will get dumped into each of these cost buckets, or these cost pools. But we have to have some logical or systematic way of doing so. So that's where this next table comes in. So just notice that this table right here, they took the production department costs, general admin, and marketing costs, and they just copied them over here. So we're just looking at the same table here. I just copied these titles over. Now, what management has determined, based on their experience, is for each of these costs, so for indirect factory wages, they said, okay, of that $6 million, what percentage do we estimate was consumed by customer orders, or by design changes, or by order size, or by our customer relations activity, or other? So in this case, management estimated that about 30% of that $6 million was consumed by customer orders. 30% of it was consumed by design changes, 20% of it consumed by order size, and 10% consumed by customer relations, and 10% by others, so those organization sustaining activities and costs. But they did that for each and every one of these overhead costs. So for the production department, all of those costs made up of the total manufacturing overhead of $14 million. Management made an estimate of what percent of each of these costs was brought about or consumed by each of these activities. Okay, so just to illustrate, for example, the office equipment depreciation of $900,000, which we see here, they estimated that about 30% of that office equipment depreciation was consumed by customer orders, 10% by design changes, nothing by order size, 20% by customer relations, and 40% in the other. So this table right here is what management will have to determine. This is not something that you as a student would need to come up with, because this table can only be constructed through management's expertise, because only management knows where costs are really being consumed, what activities are the largest consumptions of a specific cost. So what we want to do is take this table right here and really combine it with this table right here. Take that percentage in each of these cells and convert it to a dollar amount. So to illustrate, we want to find, okay, that $6 million, how are we going to break up that $6 million of indirect factory wages amongst these different cost pools that we see here? Customer orders, design changes, order size, customer relations, and other. So how I ended up finding this second table here, and it's rather simple, especially in Excel, but thankfully in Connect they give you tables as well that are nice and organized. So if I know that 30% of that $6 million is consumed by customer orders, I did this all in Excel, but I'll just illustrate quickly for some of these. $6 million. Of that $6 million, 30% of it was consumed by customer orders. 30% of $6 million is $1.8 million, so that's why I put $1.8 million here. Do the same for design changes. 30% of design changes, or 30% of the $6 million, was consumed by the design changes activity, which is also $1.8 million. The order size activity, however, that consumed 20% of that $6 million. 6 million times 20% is 1.2 million. And then customer relations, that activity consumed 10% of the $6 million of indirect factory wages. 10% of 6 million is 600,000. And the other cost pool also consumed 10%, which is another 600,000. Now, if I've divvied up that 6 million correctly, this entire row here should add up to the original 6 million. In Excel, again, it's really simple to validate numbers, but we can do that row by hand real quick. We'll do 1.8 million plus 1.8 million plus 1.2 million plus 600,000 plus 600,000. That gives me 6 million. And you want to do that for each of these costs, one by one, multiplying the total cost with the percentage that has been consumed by that activity cost pool. And that led to this breakdown of this table here. I took each of these costs and figured out what percentage of each of those costs needed to be dumped into each of these cost pools based on how much that activity consumed of each of these costs. So after you do that with each of these costs individually, you figure out how much total costs would need to be dumped into each of these cost pools. So we found out that the customer order cost pool received $4.52 million. That's how much of the $22 million we dumped into that cost bucket. We dumped $3.04 million of the $22 million into the design changes cost bucket. And the order size cost bucket, we dumped $5.2 million of the $22 million of overhead. And the customer relations cost bucket received $3.08 million of the $22 million of overhead. And then lastly, the other cost bucket received $6.16 million of the $22 million. So if you've done this entire table correctly, not only should each row on its own add up to the original cost you were allocating, but also when you add all of those totals together on the right-hand side and also at the bottom, it should add up to the original $22 million total that came from this table up above. And once we have these totals for each cost bucket, that's where we can actually now calculate our activity rates. So we see here in this activity costs, we have all the activity cost pools, and then I took each of these total costs and put it next to each of these cost pools. So the total cost in each cost bucket. So the customer orders all the way through customer relations. I excluded the other because remember that cost bucket, consists of organization, sustaining, and idle capacity costs, which we do not assign to products. So you can kind of almost think of those as period costs, so to speak, under our ABC system because they're not assigned to products. So to find the activity rate for each cost pool, we need to know what the total activity was for the entire company for the period. So the customer order cost pool, remember its activity measure was the number of customer orders. And the total customer orders that this company had for the entire period was 10,000 customer orders. The entire company, in terms of design changes, its activity measure is number of design changes, and the whole company had a total of 4,000 custom designs for the entire period. So the total activity for that cost pool is 4,000 designs. The order size activity cost pool, its activity is measured on basis of number of machine hours, because the larger the orders, the more machine hours are used. And this company used a total of 800,000 machine hours for the entire period. So that's the total measure of activity under the order size cost pool. And lastly, the customer relations cost pool, that activity measure is the number of active customers. And this company ended up serving 2,000 customers here. So that's the activity measure for that cost pool. So now how do we find the activity rate, or essentially the POR, if you want to think of it that way, for each of these cost pools? So to find this, we essentially take the total cost in that cost bucket and divide it by the total level of activity. Very similar to how we calculate a POR. So here I'll take that $4.52 million and I'm going to divide it by the total activity in that cost pool. So the activity rate for the customer orders is $452 per customer order. So essentially that's how much overhead, non-manufacturing and manufacturing overhead, is incurred when one customer order is made. We're going to do the same for all of these. So design changes. We're going to take the total cost in that cost bucket divided by the total design changes the company had for the period. So each design change costs the company in terms of manufacturing and non-manufacturing overhead about $760. Same with order size. We take the total cost in that cost bucket of $5.2 million and divide it by the 800,000 total machine hours that the company used for the period. So each machine hour that the company uses costs about $6.50 in terms of manufacturing and non-manufacturing costs. And lastly, the customer relations cost pool. We take $3.08 million in that cost bucket divided by the 2,000 customers that the company served. So each customer costs about $1,540 in terms of manufacturing, non-manufacturing overhead due to the customer relations activity. So we've now successfully figured out how much overhead to not only allocate to each cost pool, but we've also taken that information a step further and found the activity rate for each cost pool. So we're going to pause here and we're going to continue on and use these numbers here to calculate the total cost of a given customer and the customer margin, and then later on the total cost of all the products and the product margin.